The firelight dances across weathered faces in the Missouri hills, casting shadows that stretch longer than the years these men have left to live. It's a cold October night in 1881, and somewhere in these tangled hollows, what remains of the James Younger gang huddles around dying embers. The coffee tastes of chicory and regret. The wind carries the scent of wood smoke and something else, the unmistakable smell of an ending. This isn't just another night on the run. This is the last time these men will sit together as brothers, though none of them know it yet. Welcome to a story that has been polished by time and tarnished by truth. A tale of men who wore their dishonour like medals of honour, who robbed banks in the name of a cause that had already surrendered, who killed for a country that no longer existed. If you appreciate history with the rose-coloured glasses removed and the bitter truth exposed, consider subscribing and dropping a comment about where you're listening from. I'm curious who else prefers their legends served with a side of reality. Tonight, let me tell you about the James Younger gang. Not the Robin Hoods of dime novel fantasy, but the broken soldiers who couldn't stop fighting a war that had ended 15 years before. Men who genuinely believed they were continuing the noble cause of the South, but could only do so by becoming the very thieves and murderers their enemies claimed they were. This is a story about how loyalty becomes paranoia, how brotherhood becomes betrayal, and how a code of honour can become the rope that hangs you. It's about Jesse James and Cole Younger, Frank James and Bob Ford, names that echo through American mythology like gunshots in a narrow street. But strip away the myth, and what you find is infinitely more tragic. A fraternity of killers who destroyed themselves from within, proving that the most dangerous enemy is often the one you trust to watch your back. So settle into your favourite chair. Let the day's worries fade like smoke from a dying campfire, and journey with me back to a time when honour was a luxury that outlaws couldn't afford, but insisted on claiming anyway. Back to the Missouri hills, where the Civil War never truly ended. It just changed uniforms and started robbing banks. They called themselves soldiers long after the war had made them into something else entirely. In the blood-soaked Missouri hills of 1863, where the morning mist rose from scorched earth like the ghosts of burned farms, young men learned that the difference between a soldier and a killer was nothing more than which flag you carried. The James brothers, Frank and Jesse, rode with men whose names would become synonymous with American savagery. Men like William Quantrill, whose very name could empty a room faster than a drawn pistol. Men like Bloody Bill Anderson, who collected grim trophies of war and taught his followers that mercy was a weakness the Union would exploit. This was their university, and the curriculum was written in powder burns and blood. The education began with small lessons: how to ride 60 miles through the night without stopping, how to sleep in the saddle while your horse picked its way through familiar trails, how to distinguish the sound of a Spencer rifle from a Henry at 300 yards, how to read the fear in a man's eyes and know whether he'd fight, flee or fold. These were practical skills, taught by practical men who'd learned them the hard way, by surviving when others didn't. But the deeper lessons, the ones that would echo through the decades to come, were about loyalty and hatred. In the guerrilla bands, you were either brother or enemy. There was no middle ground in the Missouri brush. The man beside you had saved your life a dozen times, and you his. You'd shared your last piece of cornbread when the Federals burned the crops. You'd pulled him bleeding from his saddle after a skirmish and hidden together in root cellars while Union patrols searched above. The hatred came just as naturally. For Cole Younger, it arrived on a July morning in 1862 when Union soldiers dragged his father from their farmhouse. The old man had tried to stay neutral, tried to keep his family out of the war that was tearing Missouri apart like a wishbone. But neutrality was a luxury the border country couldn't afford. They shot him in front of his family, left his body in the dooryard like a warning. Cole's mother never recovered. She died within the year, they said from grief, though grief in those days came in many uniforms. the James family's awakening came with equal brutality. Federal militiamen, hunting for Frank, found only his stepfather, Reuben Samuel, at home. They subjected him to brutal interrogation methods in his own yard, using violence to extract information about Frank. His crime was having a stepson who rode with Quantrill. When that didn't produce Frank, they arrested his mother, Zerelda, a woman whose tongue could flay a man as efficiently as any whip. They made her sign a loyalty oath to the Union, each letter of her signature a small betrayal of everything she believed. These weren't abstract political actions. They were personal violations that transformed farm boys into killers, that made the war intimate in ways the generals in Washington and Richmond could never understand. The pinnacle of their violent education came on an August morning in 1863, when Quantrill led his men to Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence was more than a town. It was a symbol, an abolitionist stronghold, a station on the Underground Railroad. Everything the Missouri guerrillas despised distilled into one prosperous community. Quantrill's orders were simple and unambiguous. They were to kill every man and boy old enough to carry a rifle. What followed was 4 hours of methodical murder. The guerrillas moved from house to house with the efficiency of men who'd done this before. They dragged fathers from breakfast table, husbands from their wives' arms, boys barely into their teens from their beds. Cole Younger was there, his pistols growing hot from the work. Later, in the safety of distance and time, he would describe his participation as thrilling, a word that reveals more about what the war had done to these men than any casualty list could. Nearly 200 died that morning in Lawrence. The guerrillas rode out as the town burned behind them, their saddlebags heavy with plunder, their souls lighter by whatever weight conscience carries. They had crossed a line that morning, though in truth, the line had been crossed so many times before that it had worn away like a path in tall grass. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox, when the Grand Armies stacked their rifles and started the long walk home, the Missouri guerrillas faced a peculiar problem. How do you stop being what you've become? How do you return to farming when your hands have learned only the weight of revolvers? How do you sit in church on Sunday when the man in the next pew killed your brother? The answer, for many of them, was that you didn't stop. You simply changed the name of what you were doing. They found each other in the months after the war, drawn together like iron filings to a magnet. The old bonds held: Frank and Jesse James, Cole, Jim, John and Bob Younger, Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, men who'd shared campfires and killing grounds, who trusted each other with the bone-deep faith of those who'd faced death together. They gathered around a new leader, Archie Clement, one of Anderson's lieutenants. Barely 20 years old, but already a veteran of more violence than most men see in a lifetime. At first, they told themselves they were still soldiers. The war wasn't over, merely transformed. The Yankees held Missouri with their blue uniforms and their occupation government. The banks that foreclosed on Southern sympathizers' farms were just another form of federal aggression. The railroads pushing west were tools of Northern dominance. Every institution of the new order was a legitimate target in the continuation of their cause. The transition from guerrilla to outlaw was so smooth they barely noticed it happening. The skills were identical: planning raids, gathering intelligence, striking fast and disappearing into a sympathetic population. Only the targets changed. Instead of supply wagons, they hit banks. Instead of Union patrols, they ambushed payroll shipments. On a cold February afternoon in 1866, they announced their new profession to the world. The target was the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, a bank fat with deposits and sitting in a town where half the population had Southern sympathies. It was perfect for their purposes. More importantly, it would be a first. No one had ever robbed a bank in broad daylight in peacetime America. They were about to invent a new form of crime. The plan unfolded with military precision. 10 to 12 men rode into Liberty that afternoon. their long coats concealing enough firepower to outfit a small army. Most remained mounted, forming a casual but intimidating presence on the street. 2 men entered the bank, likely Frank James and Cole Younger, though the masks make certainty impossible. Inside, they approached the counter with the easy confidence of men making a routine transaction. One asked about changing a bill. When cashier Greenupbird reached for his cash drawer, he found himself staring into the barrel of a Navy Colt. The transformation from customer to robber took less than a second. They were professionals at sudden violence. The take was magnificent. Over $60,000 in gold, currency and bonds. In 10 minutes, they'd stolen more than most men would see in a lifetime. They locked Bird and his son in the vault, a gesture that seemed almost considerate until you realised they had no way of knowing if the vault had enough air for survival. But as they burst from the bank, the pretense of military discipline shattered. Someone, they never determined who, shot George Wymore as he walked across the street. He was 19, a student at William Quantrill College, and his death served no tactical purpose. He was simply in the wrong place when men with guns needed to make a point about terror. They escaped into a conveniently timed snowstorm, their tracks vanishing as completely as their guerrilla bands used to disappear into the brush. The posse that formed to pursue them might as well have been chasing smoke. Some townspeople later admitted they recognised faces among the robbers but kept silent. Whether from fear or sympathy, the result was the same. The guerrillas had transformed themselves into outlaws, and they'd done it with the same ruthless efficiency they'd once brought to war. But every transformation carries a cost. They had traded their grey guerrilla shirts for the darker cloth of criminality, and though they didn't know it yet, they had also traded their cause for something far more corrosive. They were no longer soldiers fighting for a principle, however twisted. They were thieves whose principles would become whatever they needed to justify the next robbery. Still, in those early days, they maintained the fiction. The money they stole was war booty. The banks they robbed were enemy fortifications. The men they killed were casualties of an ongoing conflict. They even shared their plunder with sympathetic farmers, playing Robin Hood to their Sherwood Forest of Missouri hills. It was a performance that required an audience, and soon enough, they would find the perfect promoter for their particular brand of theatre. But that's a story for another fire, another night. For now, it's enough to know that in a Liberty Bank on a February afternoon, the James Younger gang was born, not in glory, but in greed dressed up as grievance, not as heroes, but as men who'd learned their trade too well to stop practicing it. The Brotherhood was real, forged in the kind of suffering that either breaks men apart or welds them together forever. But like all things forged in war, it would prove brittle when tested by the slower corrosions of peace, paranoia, and profit. Every legend needs its prophet, and the James Younger gang found theirs in a former Confederate major with ink-stained fingers and a gift for transforming brutality into ballads. John Newman Edwards had refused to surrender when Lee laid down his sword. He'd followed his commander, General Joseph O. Shelby, into Mexican exile rather than accept the humiliation of defeat. When he finally returned to Missouri, he brought with him the unshakable conviction that the South had been not defeated but betrayed, not wrong but wronged. As editor of the Kansas City Times, he wielded his pen like a cavalry saber, slashing at the Republican government, the Northern carpetbaggers, and anyone else who dared suggest the Confederacy deserved its fate. In the James Younger gang, Edwards found the perfect symbols for his crusade. Here were men who refused to bow, who continued to fight the Yankee oppressors with the only weapons left to them. Never mind that those weapons were pointed at bank tellers and train passengers. In Edwards' florid prose, every robbery became a blow for freedom, every murder an act of righteous vengeance. The partnership was more calculated than romantic. Jesse James, far from the simple outlaw of popular imagination, understood the power of narrative. He fed Edwards a steady diet of letters, each one carefully crafted to reinforce the image of noble outlaws forced into crime by northern persecution. Edwards published them with the eagerness of a prophet who'd finally found his messiahs. After the Kansas City Industrial Exposition robbery in 1872, Edwards outdid himself. His editorial, titled The Chivalry of Crime, transformed a violent daylight robbery into something out of Arthurian legend. In his telling, these weren't desperate men grabbing cash at gunpoint. They were knights errant, men who might have sat with Arthur at the round table. Their crimes committed always in the glare of day and in the teeth of the multitude. The purple prose dripped from the page like honey from a comb, sweet enough to make readers forget the blood. The myth took root in Missouri soil already fertilized by resentment. To the farmers who'd seen their lands confiscated, their voting rights stripped, their whole world turned upside down by Reconstruction, the gang represented something pure, Southern men who wouldn't kneel. When the outlaws shared their spoils with these sympathizers, it wasn't charity but solidarity. Every dollar handed over was a thread in the web of protection that kept them safe from the law. But myths, like moths, are drawn to flames that eventually consume them. The fire that would burn away their carefully constructed legend was lit by Alan Pinkerton himself, the Scottish detective who'd saved Lincoln from assassination, who'd built his agency into a private army, took the pursuit of the James Younger gang as a personal crusade. When the gang captured and murdered his agent Joseph Witcher, Pinkerton's professional interest curdled into something darker. He declared it a vendetta, promising that when they met, it would mean death for one or both of them. The Pinkertons brought a new kind of warfare to Missouri, one the gang wasn't prepared for. These weren't local sheriffs who could be intimidated or federal marshals who could be evaded. These were professionals who thought like the outlaws thought, who understood that catching them meant becoming them. On the night of January 25th, 1875, that understanding led to an atrocity that would haunt both sides forever. Acting on information that Frank and Jesse were home, Pinkerton agents surrounded the James Samuel farmhouse. What happened next depends on whose version you believe. The agents claimed they threw a flare to illuminate the yard. The family said it was an incendiary bomb designed to kill. The truth, like everything in this story, lies somewhere in the blood between. The device, whatever it was, landed in the fireplace and exploded with enough force to shake the house to its foundations. When the smoke cleared and the screaming stopped, 8-year-old Archie Samuel lay dead, his small body torn apart by iron fragments. Zerelda Samuel, the boy's formidable mother, clutched the bloody stump where her right arm had been, the hand and forearm blown completely off. The James brothers weren't even there. In trying to destroy the gang, the Pinkertons had created martyrs. The newspapers, even those unsympathetic to the outlaws, condemned the raid as cowardly. The image of a maimed mother and a dead child accomplished what years of Edwards's propaganda couldn't. It made the James boys symbols of every family terrorized by authority, every home violated by power, but symbols are heavy things to carry, and Jesse felt the weight most of all. The general war against northern oppression had become deeply, irrevocably personal. His mother maimed, his little brother murdered. These weren't abstractions, but wounds that wouldn't heal. The paranoia that had always simmered beneath his calculated exterior began to boil. He started seeing Pinkerton agents in every stranger's face, hearing pursuit in every hoofbeat behind him on the trail. The gang felt the change. Where once Jesse had been coldly professional, he became erratic. Where once he'd planned with military precision, he began to chase bigger scores with less preparation. The money mattered less than the message. He wanted the world to know the James Younger gang couldn't be stopped by bombs or bullets or badges. By 1876, they'd robbed enough banks and trains to make them the most wanted men in America. The take from their crimes would be worth millions in modern money. But success bred ambition, and ambition bred carelessness. Someone, probably Jesse, though Cole later claimed credit, suggested they strike far from their usual hunting grounds. Minnesota, they reasoned, would be virgin territory. Rich banks staffed by clerks who'd never faced desperate men with guns. Easy pickings for the most experienced outlaw gang in the country. Cole Younger felt the doubt like a stone in his boot, irritating with every step toward disaster. Minnesota was too far from their sanctuary, too removed from the network of sympathizers who sheltered them. But the lure of one last great score, enough to perhaps retire on, silenced his objections. They were the James Younger gang. They'd never failed. What could possibly go wrong in a sleepy town full of farmers? Northfield, Minnesota would answer that question in gunpowder and blood. The morning of September 7th, 1876 dawned clear and cool, the kind of early fall day that makes men feel invincible. 8 members of the gang had made the long ride north. The James brothers, the 3 younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, Charlie Pitts, Clell Miller, and Bill Chadwell, their guide who claimed to know the territory. They split into 3 groups to enter the town, trying to appear casual despite the arsenal each man carried beneath his duster. The First National Bank of Northfield sat like a gift on Division Street, its doors open to the morning trade. Inside, acting cashier, Joseph Lee Haywood was preparing for what he expected to be another quiet day. He had no way of knowing he was about to become a hero. The word the gang feared most. 3 men entered the bank while the others took positions outside. The interior was smaller than they'd expected, cramped even, with barely room to maneuver. When they announced their business, the gun-barrel truth of it. Haywood did something unexpected. He lied. The vault. He insisted with a calm that must have cost him everything, was secured by a time lock. It couldn't be opened until the mechanism released at a preset hour. The robbers might have recognized the deception if they'd been familiar with such devices. But time locks were new technology, the kind of modern innovation that was rapidly making their trade obsolete. They believed him because the alternative, that a bank clerk would dare lie to armed men, was inconceivable. Outside, the situation deteriorated with stunning speed. The townspeople of Northfield weren't the docile Minnesotans the gang had imagined. These were Civil War veterans, immigrants who'd fled European violence, farmers who'd carved homes from hostile wilderness. When someone shouted that the bank was being robbed, they didn't run, they armed themselves. The street erupted. Henry Wheeler, a medical student, grabbed a rifle and put a bullet through Clell Miller's chest. Elias Stacy, a merchant, armed himself from his hardware store and opened fire. The outlaws found themselves in a shooting gallery where they were the targets, not the marksmen. Inside the bank, panic replaced planning. One of the robbers shot Joseph Lee Haywood through the head, murdering the man whose only crime was courage. They fled with almost nothing, $26.70, barely enough to buy ammunition for the massacre they'd created. In the street, Bill Chadwell lay dead, their guide to this disaster now unable to guide them home. Clell Miller was dying in the dust. Bob Younger's elbow was shattered, the bone visible through torn flesh. Jim had taken a bullet in the shoulder. Cole was hit in the hip. The invincible James Younger gang had been shot to pieces by shopkeepers and students. They ran, no other word for it, leaving their dead and their dignity in the streets of Northfield. Behind them, the largest manhunt in American history was already forming. Thousands of men would soon be combing the Minnesota countryside, and these weren't Missouri sympathizers who might look the other way. These were the brothers and neighbors of the men they'd just killed. In the desperate flight that followed, the Brotherhood that had survived Lawrence and Liberty, countless raids and narrow escapes, finally shattered. They made it to the outskirts of Mankato before the inevitable argument erupted. Bob Younger could barely stay in the saddle, his shattered arm useless, fever already setting in. The horses were blown, stumbling with exhaustion. They needed to find cover, to rest. to treat their wounds. Jesse James looked at the younger brothers, men who'd ridden with him for over a decade, who'd saved his life more times than he could count, and made a calculation as cold as a Minnesota winter. Bob's wound was slowing them down. The posse was closing in. The arithmetic of survival was simple. The wounded would die or be captured, and anyone with them would share their fate. He suggested, in that quiet voice that could make murder sound reasonable, that they split up. Just temporarily, of course. Just until the heat died down. The healthy riders could draw off pursuit while the wounded found a place to hole up. It made tactical sense. The kind of decision a military commander might make. Cole Younger saw it for what it was. Abandonment dressed up as strategy. But he also understood the truth beneath Jesse's logic. If they stayed together, they'd all hang. If they separated, some might survive. The kind of choice no one should have to make. Made by men who'd run out of good options miles and years ago. They parted there, in a patch of woods that looked like every other patch of woods, distinguished only by being the place where the James Younger gang truly died. Frank and Jesse rode west. Vanishing into the territory they knew, the Youngers and Charlie Pitts stumbled east, leaving a blood trail a child could follow. 2 weeks later, a posse caught up with the Youngers near Madelia. The fight was brief and brutal. Charlie Pitts died with a bullet in his chest. Loyal to the end, the 3 younger brothers, more dead than alive, finally surrendered. They'd been shot 27 times between them and somehow still breathed. Minnesota justice would keep them breathing for 25 more years behind bars. Jesse and Frank James made it back to Missouri, but they came back changed. The Brotherhood was broken, the myth punctured, the invisible army of sympathizers suddenly less eager to harbor men who'd brought such heat down on everyone who'd ever helped them. They went into hiding, Jesse settling in Tennessee under an assumed name, trying to play the role of respectable citizen while the paranoia ate at him like acid. When he returned to crime in 1879, it was with a new gang. Boys too young to have ridden in the war, too stupid to understand what they'd signed up for. These weren't brothers forged in shared suffering, but hired hands motivated by greed and fear. Jesse trusted none of them, and they knew it. He'd test them constantly, setting traps to see who might betray him, convinced that everyone would eventually. The hunter had become the hunted, but worse, he'd become his own tormentor. He killed Ed Miller, one of his own gang members, on mere suspicion of disloyalty. The evidence? Miller had asked too many questions about their next job. In Jesse's fracturing mind, curiosity had become conspiracy. He saw Pinkertons in every shadow, heard betrayal in every conversation, felt the noose tightening even when he was alone. The man who'd once robbed banks with military precision now led robberies that were sloppy, desperate, poorly planned. The take got smaller as the risks grew larger. The Robin Hood of Edwards' editorials had become what his enemies always said he was, a common thief whose only remarkable quality was his willingness to kill. But even common thieves need someone to hold their horses, and Jesse's options were running thin. The old rebels were dead or imprisoned. The sympathizers had grown cold. The only recruits left were starstruck boys who'd grown up reading about the James gang in dime novels, who thought riding with Jesse would make them heroes too. Boys like Bob and Charlie Ford. The unraveling was complete. The Brotherhood born in war had died in a Minnesota street, and what remained was just a paranoid killer surrounded by men he couldn't trust, living a myth he could no longer believe, waiting for the betrayal he knew must come. Robert Ford was 20 years old when he first met Jesse James, and he carried the encounter like a saint carries a relic. He'd grown up on the legend, collecting newspaper clippings about the gang's exploits, memorizing the purple prose of John Newman Edwards until he could recite whole passages about the chivalry of crime. In his imagination, Jesse James wasn't a killer, but a knight, not a thief, but a hero wronged by a corrupt world. The reality should have cured him of his delusions. The Jesse James who recruited the Ford brothers in 1881 was a shadow of the mythical figure. Paranoid, quick to anger, his famous cool calculation replaced by a jumpy irritability that made everyone around him nervous. He tested the brothers constantly, sending them on pointless errands to see if they'd be followed back, questioning them about conversations they'd had days ago to catch them in contradictions. But Bob Ford was young enough to mistake paranoia for caution, brutality for strength. When Jesse invited the brothers to move in with him and his family in St. Joseph, Bob thought it was a mark of trust. He didn't understand he was being kept close, not because Jesse trusted him, but because Jesse trusted no one. Keep your enemies closer, the saying goes, and in Jesse's corroding mind, everyone had become an enemy. The house on Lafayette Street was modest, unremarkable, the kind of place where a man calling himself Tom Howard could live quietly with his wife and 2 children. Jesse had chosen it for its normalcy, its distance from anything that might draw attention. But even in this domestic sanctuary, the outlaw couldn't rest. He kept guns in every room, checked the windows obsessively, startled at unexpected sounds like a deer scenting wolves. Living with Jesse James was like living with a loaded gun that had a hair trigger and no safety. The Ford brothers watched him pace the floors at night, muttering about betrayals real and imagined. They heard him talking to his wife about moving again, always moving, never able to stay anywhere long enough for the dust to settle. They saw him clean his pistols with the devotion of a priest preparing communion, the only ritual that seemed to calm him. Then came the night that changed everything. Wood Height, Jesse's cousin and gang member, showed up at the house drunk and belligerent. An argument erupted, over money, over respect, over the 1,000 small resentments that accumulate when trust dies. Bob Ford watched Jesse's face during the confrontation, saw something there that chilled him deeper than any Missouri winter. It wasn't anger, it was calculation. The same look a butcher gives a steer before the hammer falls. Height died that night. The official story, the one Jesse told, was self-defense. But Bob had seen the truth in Jesse's eyes. His hero, the noble outlaw of his childhood dreams, was just a killer who'd murder his own blood if it suited him. And if he'd kill a cousin, what would he do to the hired help when they outlived their usefulness? Fear, not greed, drove Bob Ford to the governor's mansion. Oh, the money mattered. $10,000 was more than a working man might see in a lifetime. But it was the certainty of his own death that made him climb those steps, that gave him the courage to make a deal with Thomas Crittenden. The governor wanted Jesse James dead or alive. Bob Ford just wanted to stay alive himself. The negotiation was swift and secret. Ford and his brother Charlie would deliver Jesse James. In return, they'd receive the reward and full pardons for any crimes they'd committed. It was the kind of bargain that made everyone involved a little less human. The governor commissioning a murder, the Fords agreeing to kill a man who'd taken them into his home. But that's what fear does. It makes cowards of heroes and heroes of cowards, depending on which end of the gun you're standing. Bob Ford returned to the house on Lafayette Street with his death warrant signed and sealed. Now he just had to wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity when Jesse's legendary reflexes would be neutralized, when the man who'd survived 100 gunfights would be vulnerable to a single bullet. The morning of April 3rd, 1882 dawned warm for early spring. The windows were open, letting in air that smelled of blooming dogwood and fresh possibility. Jesse seemed almost relaxed. The constant tension that usually gripped him loosened by the pleasant weather and the domestic routine. His wife was in the kitchen, the children playing in the yard. For a moment, you could almost believe this was just an ordinary family on an ordinary morning. After breakfast, the 3 men gathered in the living room to discuss their next robbery. Jesse had been talking about banks in Platte City, making plans with his usual attention to detail even though his heart no longer seemed to be in it. The room was warm, close, and Jesse complained about the heat. He took off his coat, folding it with the peculiar neatness he brought to everything. Then he did something Bob Ford had never seen him do before. He unbuckled his gun belt, the one that held his 2 Colt 45s, the instruments of his trade, the tools that had kept him alive through 2 decades of violence. He laid them on the sofa, moving with the casual confidence of a man in his own home, among people he trusted. For a moment, Bob Ford couldn't believe it. Jesse James, unarmed, with his back turned. Jesse James, human and vulnerable and unaware that death stood behind him in the form of a 20-year-old boy with shaking hands. Jesse noticed a picture on the wall, dusty or crooked. The stories vary. He grabbed a chair, positioned it beneath the frame, and stepped up to adjust it. A simple domestic act, the kind of thing any man might do in his own home. His back was completely turned, his attention entirely focused on the small task at hand. Bob Ford drew his pistol, a gift from Jesse himself, which added another layer of bitter irony to what was about to happen. He aimed at the base of Jesse's skull, the spot where spine meets brain, where life becomes death in an instant. His hand was steady now, the shaking gone, replaced by the terrible clarity that comes when fear makes its final demand. The shot was impossibly loud in the small room. It echoed off the walls, rattled the windows, sent the children in the yard running for their mother. Jesse James fell forward off the chair, dead before he hit the floor. Blood pooled beneath his head, soaking into the carpet his wife had picked out when they moved in, trying to make this house a home. Bob Ford stood there, gun still in his hand, smoke still curling from the barrel, watching the blood spread and wondering why he didn't feel like a hero. Charlie was already moving, heading for the door, ready to run to the authorities and claim their reward. But Bob couldn't move, couldn't look away from what he'd done. He'd killed Jesse James, the man who'd survived the Lawrence raid, who'd robbed dozens of banks and trains, who'd outrun posses and outsmarted Pinkertons, was dead on his own living room floor with a hole in his head and his guns on the sofa. Useless as his legend. The aftermath unfolded like a play where everyone knew their parts. The Ford brothers turned themselves in, were charged with murder, tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang, all in a single day. Then, in the final act of the governor's choreographed justice, they received their pardons. The speed of it shocked even those who understood it was all arranged. Justice perverted into theatre, law twisted into assassination. Bob Ford got his money, or at least part of it. He got his fame too, though it came flavoured with a bitterness he'd taste for the rest of his short life. The ballad started almost immediately, and they didn't call him a hero. The dirty little coward, they sang, who shot Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave. He'd eaten at Jesse's table, slept under Jesse's roof, and then shot him in the back of the head. In the court of public opinion, that made him worse than any outlaw. He tried to capitalise on his notoriety, touring with a stage show where he and Charlie reenacted the assassination nightly. Imagine that. Killing your hero once for money, then killing him again and again for pennies from gawkers who came to hiss at you. Charlie couldn't take it. The guilt, the public hatred, the weight of what they'd done crushed him. He killed himself in 1884, choosing his own bullet over the slow death of living with himself. Bob Ford drifted west, carrying his infamy like a disease. He opened a saloon in Creede, Colorado, serving whiskey to miners who knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. Some probably even sang the ballad in his presence, watching his face for a reaction, for some sign of the guilt that must surely be eating him alive. On June 8th, 1892, a man named Edward O'Kelly walked into Ford's saloon carrying a shotgun. He had his reasons. Some said it was about a woman, others that he wanted the fame of killing the man who killed Jesse James. The reasons mattered less than the result. O'Kelly called out a greeting, waited for Ford to turn, and gave him both barrels of the shotgun. Bob Ford died as he'd lived after April 3rd, 1882, as a footnote to Jesse James's story. The man who'd wanted to be a hero became instead a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal, the cost of survival, the weight of being the one who pulls the trigger when the hero's back is turned. The coward's tale was complete, from starstruck boy to desperate assassin to murdered saloon keeper. Bob Ford had travelled the full circuit of American violence. He'd gotten everything he'd wanted, the money, the fame, the proximity to legend, and it had poisoned every day of his remaining life. In the end, he was just another casualty of the James Younger gang, destroyed not by their bullets, but by their myth. The funeral was a sensation. Thousands came to see the body of Jesse James, to verify with their own eyes that the devil was finally dead. They filed past the coffin where he lay dressed in his best suit, looking smaller somehow than the giant of their imaginations. His wife had to be restrained from throwing herself on the body. His mother, one-armed Zerelda, stood like a stone monument to grief and rage, damning Bob Ford and Governor Crittenden with every breath. The photographers came too, setting up their equipment to capture the scene for posterity. Jesse James in death became what he'd always wanted to be in life, an image, a story, a legend freed from the messy reality of the man himself. The pictures would be sold for years afterward, souvenirs of American violence packaged for public consumption. But the real transformation happened in the telling. Within days of his death, Jesse James began his second life as a folk hero. The man who'd shot unarmed bank clerks became a Robin Hood. The paranoid killer who'd murdered his own gang members became a betrayed hero. The railroad companies and banks he'd robbed were cast as the real villains, while Jesse became the people's champion, striking back at corporate greed. John Newman Edwards, freed from the need to coordinate with the living Jesse, wrote his masterpiece obituary. Jesse wasn't a criminal, Edwards proclaimed, but a victim of circumstance. Fate had made him an outlaw, the government had made him a killer, and society had made him a legend. The purple prose flowed like Missouri honey, sweet enough to make people forget the blood and bitter enough to keep the anger alive. The myth grew with each telling. In the ballads and dime novels, Jesse never shot anyone who didn't deserve it, never stole from anyone who couldn't afford it, never betrayed the cause he claimed to serve. The messy truth that he was a man twisted by war into something monstrous, who dressed his violence in political rhetoric to make it palatable, got buried deeper with each verse sung in his honour. Cole Younger lived to see it all from his cell in Stillwater Prison. He served 25 years for Northfield, watching from behind bars as his former partner transformed from killer to legend. When he was finally paroled in 1901, reporters asked him about Jesse, about the old days, about what really happened. Cole, who'd learned the value of silence, gave them what they wanted. Stories that confirmed the myth rather than complicated it. Even he, who'd been abandoned in Minnesota, who'd lost his brothers to prison because of Jesse's decision, couldn't bring himself to tell the whole truth, because the truth was more tragic than any legend. The James Younger gang had been a brotherhood born from genuine trauma, forged in real suffering, dedicated to a cause they actually believed in. They weren't common criminals who used politics as cover. They were political soldiers who became criminals when their war ended, and they didn't know how to be anything else. Their honour, and they had one, twisted though it was, demanded they continue fighting. Their loyalty to each other and to their lost cause was real, even when it led them to robbery and murder. They genuinely believed, at least in the beginning, that they were continuing the noble fight their side had lost on the battlefield. But honour built on hatred is like a house built on sand. It might stand for a while, might even look impressive from a distance, but the first real storm will bring it crashing down. Their storm came in the streets of Northfield, where their assumptions about northern weakness met northern lead, where their brotherhood fractured under the pressure of survival. What followed was inevitable. Jesse's paranoia, growing from the seed planted when the Pinkertons killed his little brother, flowered into full madness. The loyalty that had been their strength became a liability when every gesture of friendship looked like potential betrayal. The code of honor that justified robbing banks couldn't justify murdering your own men, but Jesse did it anyway, becoming in the end the very thing his enemies had always said he was. Bob Ford's betrayal was just the final act in a tragedy written by the gang themselves. They created the conditions for their own destruction, teaching violence to boys who would eventually turn it against them, spreading fear until someone got scared enough to shoot back, living by a code that demanded loyalty while practicing betrayal. The saddest part? They might have been something else. These were intelligent men, natural leaders, brilliant tacticians, in a different world, one where the war ended cleanly and reconstruction came with reconciliation instead of revenge. They might have been the successful businessmen they pretended to be while hiding under aliases. Cole Younger might have been a prosperous farmer. Jesse James might have been a bank president instead of a bank robber. But that's not the world they lived in. They lived in a world where brother fought brother, where honor meant never forgetting a wrong, where loyalty meant following your friends into hell even when you could see the flames. They chose their path with eyes wide open, even if they couldn't see where it led. So rest now, in the quiet after violence, in the peace these men never found. Rest with the knowledge that honor without mercy is just pride with a weapon, that loyalty without wisdom is just stubbornness with companions, that a cause without conscience is just an excuse for the inexcusable. The James Younger gang died as they lived, violently, suddenly, and wrapped in myths of their own making. They were outlaws who believed in honor, killers who thought themselves soldiers, brothers who betrayed each other in the end. Their tragedy wasn't that they were evil men pretending to be good. Their tragedy was that they were men who might have been good, if only they'd known how to stop being what war had made them. In the Missouri hills, the last campfires have long since turned to ash. The men who sat around them are dust and legend now, their arguments settled by time's final judgment. What remains is the echo of their story, a warning about the price of honor without mercy, the cost of loyalty without limits, and the terrible truth that sometimes the enemy we fight hardest is the one we carry within ourselves. Sleep well and dream of better choices.